Hey everyone, it's Drayton from Scale Trains, and I've got some exciting news to share with you today. The all-new Rivet Counter HO Scale GE AC44C6Ms are in stock now at scaletrains.com and select retailers, and we're excited because this is our latest wide cab GE. It's a unique locomotive. It differentiates quite a bit actually from the Dash 9s and the AC4400s. So in today's Rivet Counter Spotlight video, we're going to dive into those details. We're going to talk to one of the product developers behind the project manager. Stay tuned. Hey Chris, thanks for joining us for this C6M video. We're glad to have you here. So as the project manager of this Rivet Counter locomotive, can you kind of walk me through the prototype history? What is a C6M and how does it differentiate from, say, an AC4400?
Sure. So the C6Ms, which is kind of the shortened version that we internally and a lot of others will call them, is they under Norfolk Southern, they were either C40-9s or C44-9s that have been rebuilt into these. For some of the other railroads, they've taken either AC4400s or even with UP, they've used AC6000s that they've rebuilt into their modernized units. But with NS, their earliest versions that they had rebuilt began in about 2015. At the same time, BNSF also kind of dipped their toe into the rebuild market, but didn't really get that much into it. So with Norfolk Southern's rebuilt units, they started with the C40-9s, or the top hats, as they're commonly called. With these units, there was a considerable amount of internal and external upgrades that were kind of put onto the units to modernize them, which is what the M in the name C6M comes from, is modernized.
Got it.
Yeah, and this brings them up to a more. It brings the fleet of Norfolk Southern to be more uniform and easy to service instead of having such a large diversity of locomotives. So it brings them into much more in line with the ET44s and ES44s.
And those are all AC traction. The more modern ones are all ACs, right?
Yes, they're all AC, whereas all of Norfolk Southern's, they're Dash 9s, and all of the Dash 9s were all of DC traction. And so that was another upgrade that NS had done with this, was they were always kind of a long holdout of all of the class 1s of adopting AC traction. And so with these, they were all given AC traction. So internally, some of the major upgrades that were done was GE gave what they called their consolidated control architecture, which was significant wiring upgrades, obviously from DC to AC. And then later, Wabtec would call this their modular control architecture. And this was paired with what they also called the FDL Advantage program, which optimized the turbocharger to be fed by a single high pressure pump instead of the previously 16 individual pumps. And this, they claimed, increased fuel efficiency by up to 18% and also increased reliability of the units as well.
Yeah, I was going to say less maintenance is what it sounds like. Fewer parts that could go wrong.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. So it's kind of what you don't see under the hood.
Yeah. And externally, they kind of all look the same, but as we'll get to later in the video, no C6M is really the same.
No, yeah, I mean, to the layperson, they still look like a Dash 9, or on the other railroads, an AC4400. They look about the same, but there are significant upgrades that have been done.
Yeah, and so a lot, like what you're saying, a lot of it was internal. And I remember you saying the first like 120 or 125 were the former C40-9s. those were kind of
Yes.
interesting because they were only 4,000 horsepower, but they also had that standardized or Spartan cab, which a lot of us
Hmm.
rail fans really love to take pictures of because NS was the only railroad that had those. It
Yeah.
was sad to see those go, but I think what was it, 2015 when the 4000 and the 4001 rolled out in that really cool looking blue, people call it the Sonic bonnet paint scheme. Was that 2015 when they rolled that out?
Yeah, it was about the end of 2015 when the first units rolled off, and NS had them in kind of a neat, attractive paint scheme like the Sonic bonnet, um, and so it, it really was an exciting thing that NS did, to something to be proud of modernizing their fleet for sure. And so that attractive paint scheme, which they're still wearing to this day, is neat to see.
So I was going to ask you, why do railroads like NS and BNSF and lately CSX, why have they been exploring rebuilds as opposed to say the new Tier 4 locomotives or like Canadian National? They've even had some Tier 4 credit units. They've gotten some
Hmm.
of the older ES44 models. Why this rebuild program? And Wabtec, GE, they were very involved, so they're still working with a locomotive manufacturer, but they're just remanufacturing. So is there cost savings in addition to the upgraded electronics and traction?
Yeah, I mean, modernizing a unit that still has a lot of life in it. I mean, these units are only 20 years old, or maybe 25, but there's still a lot of life in these units left. And so upgrading them and modernizing them will give them at easy another 20 plus years. It also, as I mentioned before, it brings them more in line with many of their other newer units. So servicing them, they're in line with them, and so they share more components with each other. Um, Also, and you won't necessarily hear a lot of the class ones say this. A lot of the class ones haven't really gotten on board with adopting tier 4 units. Um, that's kind of the quiet part. A lot of them don't like to say out loud. Tier 4 units, there's still some growing pains there with them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I remember, like with the EMD locomotive, there
Hmm.
were not a whole lot of them out in service. We got to see a few of them running here in East Tennessee a few years ago, but seems like General Electric definitely has, and I guess now Wabtec has much more of a market advantage there. But
Yeah.
these rebuild programs seem to really have taken off. And one of the things that I've learned from working here at Scale Trains, like I mentioned earlier, is that no C6M rebuild is really the same. And I wanted to talk to you about, as the project manager, the difficulty in selecting road numbers for this series in this first run. How did we go about doing that, and how difficult was it to find a set of C6Ms that were close enough to where we could get all those rivet counter details right?
Yeah, so the C6Ms are pretty all over the map as far as details go. And especially with kind of the infancy of this rebuild program, there wasn't really some fully flushed out things. And so you would get little changes from like the earliest units, like 4001 and 2, that didn't carry forward with later units. And so the handrails above, the inverter cabinets changed. The little subtle details with access doors on the blower cabinets changed here and there. And so as the program kind of grew, things would kind of change a little bit. I mean, also you'd see the HVAC vent panels underneath the engineer would change from either a 17 louver pattern or a 13 louver pattern. And so even though the cabs are generally the same on all of them, there's little kind of additional parts that would kind of change around. And also, it also depends on what happened during the dash nines, even prior to rebuild. The units would get in wrecks or maintenance. The engine compartment hoods would kind of get switched around. And so you would have engine compartments that would have early style latches as they were built. And then sometimes they would get swapped out with something that had later style latches. And also because of this, you'd get ones with the early style, more rounded roofs over the engine compartment. And then you'd get some that would have the more angular style roofs. And some would have the large, with the early rounded roofs, you'd get the larger doors, or you'd get the ones with the bifold doors. Horns were all over the place. Plows are all over the place on these. There's a lot of interesting changing details. And then there's even, as you start getting into the later rebuilds, a lot of other changes that kind of happen with them as well. And so the units that we're releasing on their first run, I've kind of named them the early versions, which were the first 125 rebuilt from the C40-9s.
Gotcha. Okay. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about is about how much of the original units did they keep during the rebuild process? Obviously, the cab was replaced. Did they
Mhm.
keep a lot of like the engine hood compartments, or because some of them I've seen where there's a couple of C6Ms, some later units that actually have the thoroughbred logo from an
Yeah.
old Dash 9 that never got repainted, or maybe they had a turbocharger go bad and they had to replace it with the Dash 9. It seemed like they just picked that up and set the Dash 9 engine compartment doors right
Yeah.
on top of it. I was kind of curious how much they kept.
So yeah, it's really the best example to look at with what was changed on the locomotives is to look at the unit 4047, which we're offering on this first run. That's the one that's partial primer. So everything that's in primer on that locomotive is new. Everything that was in NS paint, that was original.
Really?
And
Okay.
yeah, so everything, what you'll largely see is everything forward from the engine compartment up to the cab is new components. Everything from the engine compartment to the dynamic, or excuse me, to the radiator compartment is original to the as delivered locomotive. Also, pretty much everything from the sills down to the trucks is original. However, on the C40-9s, um, the all of the C40-9s came with step wheels in the front and the rear. However, with rebuilding these at the front steps, they put them to a more modern 5-step wheel. And also the pattern of the step wheel went from the early step wheel design where it kind of drops down vertically and then kind of notches in and then goes down vertically to the more modern tapered design. So on the front of the locomotive, you have the more modern tapered design. The rear of the locomotive, you have the notched in version with the 4 steps. And so it's kind of
Wow.
an interesting, funny feature you only see on the first 125 units.
Yeah, like, and I've seen hundreds and hundreds of these things over the past, 10 years now. It's
Mhm.
crazy to think that they've been rebuilding these things for a decade. Um, but I'd never noticed that. And that was
Yeah,
something I learned after we made the announcement. Now, Chris, 4047, if I'm not mistaken, that unit spent some time in your backyard out in
it
Utah.
did. Yeah. So a lot of the Utah modelers are all giddy about 4047, and so they've asked me if I picked this unit because of that. The reality is I didn't start this project. I kind of came in after it had been started, and so that number had already been chosen before, but I would have picked it.
I don't blame you. That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, and it's a
Yeah,
good
there.
way to show too that these units don't just stay east of the Mississippi River. They get
Oh no, we
over.
see the C6Ms out here all the time.
That's cool. That's
Yeah.
cool. What out of all of the versions that we're offering, would you say that's your favorite one in this run?
Probably in this run, yeah, that is my favorite unit. But there's a lot of neat paint schemes in later runs and later build versions that we'll be able to get into, which there's a lot of differences between the early versions and those.
Sure. Yeah, and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you because I know we're going to have some customers in the comments. What about this unit? What about that
Yeah.
unit? Thank a railroader and the tag heritage units, or unit, I should say,
Yeah.
singular. Are those in the pipeline at some point?
Yes, those are both in the pipeline. Those should be coming in the second run. And so the second run will be more focusing on some of, at the time, we called them the later rebuilds. And so we have there's kind of an early, an intermediate, and a later rebuild versions of these. Now with the C6Ms under NS, there's an even later version, and then there's also former CEFX AC4400s that are being rebuilt that are different from a lot of the C6Ms, and those ones are all being numbered. Most of the rebuilds are in the 4,000 numbers, but the former CFX units are kind of in the later. They're up to 3,000 or up to 4,000, so they're like the 39,000 series or 3,900 series, excuse me. But really, what you start to see in some of the intermediate and later versions, NS or Wabtec changed out the blower cabinet. It's a different design that you see in the earlier rebuilds. And so in the earlier versions, the blower cabinet kind of comes across and then steps down and then notches back up. Whereas the later cabinets, it's just an even box cabinet across. And then as you start to get into the even later units, which includes the tag and the employee unit, you get you see that same cabinet. There's a few subtle differences between the cab. And then you also, the units came from later built -9s, and so there's some other features that were common in the later deliveries of -9s that are carried on that series as well. The newest ones, which are being rebuilt, kind of starting 2025, NS is now starting to adopt the raised radiators that you commonly see on the Union Pacific and CSX and Canadian Pacific and even on the CNs, which is a shutter system. NS is now starting to add that on the most recent deliveries.
Interesting. Excuse me. I always like the look of the shuttered radiators. Just for some reason, it kind of remind me of like the old -8s back in the 90s. Some of the former Conrail and LMS units had those. I always like to see those. So that's kind of cool. Well, Chris, thanks for kind of giving us an overview of the history of the prototype and some of those details that you just never think of, like the steps. You'd never think of them unless you physically worked on them every day in real life, or if you're a product developer as the project manager of this. So really appreciate your time.